Hello, I'm Rebecca Shaw, a lecturer in law here at the University of Leeds. And in this short video, I'm going to introduce you to narrative inquiry. Narrative inquiry is a qualitative research method that involves analysing stories. Now, narrative is a vital human activity that structures experience and gives it meaning. And narrative inquiry is therefore one way of making sense of that knowledge and experience. So crucially, it changes the question from what actually happened to how do people make sense of what happened. Now, narrative inquiry is closely linked to life history and biography because it involves telling stories. For some researchers, narrative inquiry is an approach to analysing different kinds of data. For others, it is this, but in addition, the researcher deliberately seeks to stimulate the telling of stories. Now, why should we use stories in research? For narrative inquiry, a story is the unit of analysis. And these stories can be found in textual data, for example, in unstructured diaries, activities, letters, field notes, and so on. They can be elicited in oral accounts, for example, through a narrative interview. Or stories can be found in visual data, for example, in photographs, filming, or paintings. Through these stories, you can gain access to the personal experiences of the storyteller. They frame, highlight, and reveal life experiences in a narrative structure. And there is a power in stories which communicate human meaning and experience. So as a result, the narrative inquiry approach is best used when the researcher wants to explore the life experiences of a person or persons. Now, before we move on to looking at different forms of narrative analysis, it's worth pausing and considering terminology here. Story, plot, narrative, these are terms that are often used interchangeably, particularly in everyday conversation. However, they are three distinct terms, each with their own meaning. Because no sooner had narrative come of age as a theoretical concept, there was this territorial expansion into other fields. And this was accompanied by a semantic broadening of these terms. The term narrative therefore carries many meanings and is used in a variety of different ways by different disciplines. It began with Aristotle's examination of Greek tragedy, with plot as the conversion of the bare bones of story into a tightly structured aesthetic unit with a beginning, middle, and end. So plot is the ordering of those incidents, the events and existence of the story, and it is enacted by the characters who, according to Aristotle, take second place to plot. Now, there have been many different traditions of narrative theory since, for example, French structuralism, Russian formalism, post-structuralism, cultural analysis, and postmodernism. However, what these traditions do have in common is one thing. They see plot as different from story. So a story in its simplest terms is what is told. It's the basic chronology of events, out of which something more complex, the plot, is constructed. The plot produces meaning through temporal sequence and progression. It refers to how the story is transmitted, not the what. And together, plot and story form the narrative. So when it comes to designing narrative inquiry, there are a number of points to consider. Particularly, first of all, whether it is appropriate to help you address and answer your own research question and your research aims. Now, this is particularly if you are eliciting oral accounts through semi-structured, unstructured, or even narrative interviews. Narrative inquiry gives the narrator, the participant, personal freedom and choice in telling their story. It's important that you consider building relationships with your participants. So do you have access to your participants and can you foster long-term collaborative relationships with them? Could this be used alongside another method as part of a mixed method study? And then it's worth considering which forms of narrative are useful for your study. Are you talking about oral, textual, or visual narratives? Consider also your own role in co-constructing the narrative, particularly as this is a collaborative endeavour between researcher and participant. And then finally, think about how will you analyse your data. There are different forms of narrative analysis, which I will discuss in a moment. Let's talk about the narrative interview. Now, this goes beyond the typical question and answer format. In fact, the influencer of the interviewer should be minimal. Instead, it encourages the interviewee to tell a story about a significant event in their life and the social context. And the narration schema substitutes the question and answer schema. So there are a number of basic phases of the narrative interview, as you can see in the table here. First up is the initiation. Here, the context of the investigation is explained, permission to record is acquired, and the procedure of the narrative interview is explained. So this is where there is going to be an initial question, followed by uninterrupted storytelling, and then the questioning phase. When the narration starts, it must not be interrupted until there is a clear coda. That is, where the interviewee pauses and signals the end of the story. During the narration, it's important that you don't comment other than giving non-verbal signals of listening and encouragement to continue. While listening, you can develop questions for the next phase of the interview. When the interviewee marks the coda at the end of the story, you can probe for anything else, saying something like, "Is this all you want to tell me?" Or, "Is there anything else you want to say?" As the narration comes to a natural end, you can begin the questioning phase. Your exmanent questions are translated into immanent questions using the language of the interviewee. It's important in this questioning phase that you don't ask why questions. Only ask questions concerning the events, such as, what happened before or after? Then what happened? Ask only immanent questions using the words of the interviewee, and be careful not to point out contradictions in the narrative. Now, the final phase, the concluding talk, this often occurs once the recording device is switched off. Here you can ask your why questions as entry points for the analysis, and use notes to summarize the small talk immediately after the interview. Now, once you've conducted or gathered your stories for analysis, it's important then to think about how you're going to analyze them. Because there is a family of methods for interpreting stories or texts that have this storied form. And it delves into the content and the form of the story, prompting you to think beyond just the surface of the story. So unlike other qualitative analysis techniques, narrative analysis focuses on keeping the story intact, rather than breaking it apart through coding. And there are 4 main different models of narrative analysis, as identified by the sociologist Catherine Reisman. The first of these is structural narrative analysis, also known as the Lebovian approach. And this emphasizes the form of the story. The question asked is how a story is organized, and it's more concerned with the small building blocks of the story and uses 6 elements of a story as outlined by linguist William Lebov. These elements include the abstract, orientation, complicating action, evaluation, resolution, and coda. Then we have thematic narrative analysis. This answers the what question, and the content of what is being told is central to the analysis. Now, the main difference with other forms of thematic analysis is that the unit of analysis, as I said, is the complete story. Then we have dialogic or performative narrative analysis, which Reisman describes as the study of how speech is created in interaction and through dialogue. So the interaction in which narrating takes place is considered crucial regarding which narrative is told and how it is understood by the audience. And finally, we have visual narrative analysis. So this form of analysis focuses on other forms of communication in different visual genres, considering how stories are told with images or how people tell a story about images that themselves tell a story. So much like dialogic and performative analysis, visual narrative inquiry spans a broad spectrum of methods. So in conclusion, using stories in social research is incredibly valuable as it gives you access to the personal experiences of the storyteller. They frame, highlight, and reveal life experiences in a narrative structure. And using the story as a unit of analysis, we can explore various layers of society and social life via these narratives, whether that's individual stories, collective or community stories, or cultural and organizational stories. They provide an insight into how we make sense of the world and our place in it, providing rich, detailed insight into the how and why, going beyond statistics. Now, there are multiple models of analysis, and you can use different models to come up with an approach that best suits your own research question and objectives. If you want to know more, check out the references that have been provided at the end of this video.